Chapter 30. The afternoon that Ken finished copying his composition, he went over to the post office with his mother in the Studebaker and dropped the long envelope containing his neat 3 pages of writing and his mother's letter into the mailbox. Driving back to the ranch, he sat silent, aware of peculiar feelings within himself. It was another achievement, something that might amount to quite a good deal in the estimation of his father and Mr. Gibson. It was to be kept a secret from his father until Mr. Gibson's answer came. "Of course he may not answer," said Nell. "He may just tell you when you and Howard get there." This made school feel very near, and that made Ken think about Flicka. He had never dreamed that at the end of the summer Flicka would still be lame and half sick. He hated to leave her that way. After he had gone, no one would care for her so devotedly. She would have to shift for herself. She would need her rations of oats for a long time yet to put the flesh back on her bones. She had been getting so thin lately, thinner it seemed every day, and her coat was losing its fine color and sheen. When they reached home, his mother told him to find Howard and bring him in, so they could both try on their winter clothes. She wanted to find out what new things would be needed before Christmas, what was outgrown, what worn out, what would do, how many new markers she must sew on, how many new socks and pants and undershirts. She finished going over the clothes, sent the boys out, and went in and made the fire for supper. Then she took her sewing basket and the markers and the underclothes and sat down in a chair by the kitchen window. She was thinking about Ken, and her face was very sad. What would Rob do when he knew that Flicka was wasting away? The men were talking about it already. Gus had said to her only that morning, "It's the fever. It burns up her flesh. If you could stop the fever, she might get well." Rob had no eyes and no thought for anything but the haying and the weather. The extra men had gone. Rob and Tim and Gus were storing the baled hay in the barn, stacking the loose hay in long lozenges that gradually took on shape and style. The sides forked down until they were smooth and perpendicular, the tops shaped in rounded ridge to shed rain and snow. Each time they got one stack topped, they stretched long strands of baling wire over it to bind it to the earth, and hung heavy railroad ties on the ends of the wire. This kept the wind from blowing the stacks away. The weather still held, but each night the banks of cloud that crept over the sky were heavier, and sometimes thunder rumbled intermittently for hours. Nell dropped her sewing in her lap and looked out of the window, brows knitted with anxiety and distress. "The filly won't pull out of it," Rob had said when the little mare was first hurt, and he was right. Flicka was going to die. If Rob knew, if perhaps he had known ever since the generalized infection had poisoned her bloodstream and he had given her the shot of serum, he had said nothing. And when the men talked about her, he pretended not to hear. But Ken, how could he have failed to see that every day left the little filly with less flesh, less strength, less life? Nell remembered a friend whose baby had been wasting away, and yet, because of the daily care and closeness, the warmth and little smiles and tiny arms still clinging, did not know it until the very end. Ken did not know. Soon Flicka began to go down in flesh so rapidly that almost overnight she wasted away to nothing. Every rib showed. The glossy hide was dull and brittle and was pulled over her skeleton as if she was a dead horse. For convenience of unloading, the big hay wagon was left near the cow-barn corrals every evening, And one morning, as McLaughlin and Howard and the men were walking down to it, Gus leading one of the work teams that was to be harnessed into it, Ken was walking with them, carrying the can of oats under his arm. He was going to take Flicka her breakfast. The little mare was waiting for him at the gate of the corral. When McLaughlin saw her, he stopped walking, and a look of horror spread over his face. "What in God's name is that?" he shouted. They all stopped walking and looked at her, and Ken, with a face as white as paper, looked back at his father. "It's Flicka," he whispered. "She's been getting awfully thin." "Thin?" roared McLaughlin. Gus shook his curly head sadly. "I been thinking she's not gonna pull out of it," he said. "Pull out of it? She's dead already." McLaughlin turned to stare at Ken. "How long has she been like that?" "She's been going down awful fast the last few days," faltered Ken. "It's the fever," said Gus. "It's burning her up." Tim said, "It's an awful pity. She was a nifty little filly. Hard luck, Ken." McLaughlin looked at her again. She was nickering for Ken. Her head was up, looking at him. She was just bones and a dull, lusterless hide. "That's the end," roared McLaughlin. "I won't have a thing like that on my place." He walked on to harness the team, and Ken went slowly to Flicka and down the path to the stream, with the little creature hopping at its heels. He poured the oats in her feed box, and she dipped her nose in and ate them. From the terrace, Nell had seen and heard all that had been said, and she ran down the path to Ken. As she approached, he looked at her, and she saw his blue eyes sunken into his head, staring. "She's going to die," he whispered. "Oh, Kenny, darling," murmured Nell. She put one arm across the boy's shoulder, and with the other smoothed the harsh coat of the filly. Her own eyes were filled with tears, but Ken's were dry. "She still eats her oats," he said mechanically. Nell said nothing. She caressed the little mare. "Poor little girl," she murmured, and to herself thought, "Oh, why couldn't it have waited until Ken was away?" At dinner, Ken ate nothing. Howard said, "Ken isn't eating his dinner. Doesn't he have to eat, Mother?" But Nell answered, "Leave him alone." Ken had understood what his father meant when he said, "I won't have a thing like that on my place." To allow an animal to die a lingering death was something his father would not do. Flicka was to be shot. He didn't hear his father give the order to Gus. "Pick a time when Ken isn't around, Gus, and take the Winchester and put the filly out of her misery." "Yeah, boss." Ken watched the gun rack in the dining room. All the guns were standing in it. No guns were allowed in the bunkhouse. Going through the dining room to the kitchen 3 times a day for meals, Ken's eyes scanned the weapons to make sure they were all there. That night, they were not all there. The Winchester was missing. When Ken saw that, he stopped walking. He felt dizzy. He kept staring at the gun rack, telling himself that it surely was there. He counted again. He couldn't see clearly. Then he felt an arm across his shoulders and heard his father's voice. "I know, son. Some things are awful hard to take. We just have to take 'em. I have to, too." Ken got hold of his father's hand and held on. It helped steady him. Finally, he looked up. Rob looked down and smiled at him and gave him a little shake and squeeze. Ken managed a smile, too. "All right now?" "All right, Dad." They walked into supper together. Ken even ate a little. But Nell looked thoughtfully at the ashen color of his face and at the little pulse that was beating in the side of his neck. After supper, Ken carried Flicka her oats, but he had to coax her, and she would hardly touch them. She stood with her head hanging, but when he stroked it and talked to her, she pressed her face into his chest and was content. He could feel the burning heat of her body. It didn't seem possible that anything so thin could be alive. Presently, Ken saw Gus come into the pasture, carrying the Winchester. When he saw Ken, he changed his direction and sauntered along as if he was out to shoot cottontails. Ken ran to him. "When are you going to do it, Gus?" "I was going down soon now before it got dark." "Gus, don't do it tonight. Wait till morning. Just one more night, Gus." "Well, in the morning then, but it got to be done, Ken. Your father gives the order." "I know. I won't say anything more." Gus went back to the bunkhouse, and Ken returned to Flicka. He stood by her, smoothing and caressing her as he always did. Usually he talked to her, but he couldn't do that now. There was only one thing in his mind, and he couldn't talk about that. Now and then, as if it came from someone else, he heard a little moan. It was he himself that was moaning. Below the cottonwood trees, the darkness fell swiftly, and Ken and Flicka were hidden in it together. It folded them around and held them close. He couldn't see her, and she couldn't see him, but he moved around her, and her head turned to follow him, so that her muzzle rested against him, as she always did. The darkness pressed them closer together. At 9 o'clock, Howard was sent by Nell to call Ken. He stood at the corral gate, shouting. Again there was the sound of soft moaning. Then Ken pressed a last kiss on Flicka's face and went up the hill under the cottonwoods. Flicka was still standing in her nursery when the full moon rose at 10. It was the hunter's moon, as yellow as the harvest moon, but not so large. The sun was silent, with the profound silence of a sea becalmed. Even the faint roaring of the earth, like the roaring of a shell, was hushed. It waited. If the mind of a living being, man or beast, is clear, there are 4 warnings of the approach of death. The body gets ready. One by one, the active functions cease, till at last the currents of living force become inverted in a down-whirling spiral into which the creature is drawn, spinning faster and faster toward the vortex. All of this can be felt, and feeling this, Flicka knew that her time had come. Her head hung low. Her legs were slightly splayed under her. Though through force of habit she stood by the feed box, she had not touched the oats. Every cell in her body was seared with fierce, burning fever, and sometimes her mind was in a drifting delirium, sometimes in coma, sometimes clear and knowing. Flicka's wounds did not pain her, but the suction of the down-whirling spiral was an agony felt through every part of her. Now and then her young body found strength to fight against it. She struggled. She lifted her head. She turned it toward the path down which Ken's running feet had come 1,000 times that summer. He was all that she had, and all that she could hope for. But tonight, there was no sound, no step, no help. For minutes she stayed so, her ears strained for the sound of him, longing and listening, then gradually succumbed to the tug of those inner quicksands and drooped, wavering, over the earth. In one of the surges of rebellion, she neighed. Miles away on the upland, her sire heard and answered. Animals call to each other as friends in passing, or as sentries challenge, who goes there? And the answer announced a friend or foe. But Banner, knowing that Flicka was one of his own, gave the master word as Ken had read it out of the Jungle Book to Flicka. "We be of one blood, ye and I." And the loud kingly cry, made into a faint trumpet call by the distance, drifted across the miles, across the roads, across the barbed wire barricades that intervened, and burned a crossfire of hope into the fever that was consuming Flicka. She began to prance jerkily like a marionette pulled by strings. All that was left in her of will and willpower gathered itself, and she trotted downstream along the bank. She jarred to a sudden stop, standing in terror with head low and feet braced out, as if she had become face to face with a phantom. Gradually, the terror went out of her, but she held the ridiculous posture as if unable to move. Her head turned again to the ranch house. Would he come? She was thirsty. The smell of the fresh running water drew her. She waded into the stream and drank, got her fill, lifted her head, turned it again toward the house. The cool water rippled against her legs. There was no sound from the house, no feet running upon the path, and suddenly the last of her little strength was gone. Lunging forward, she fell, half on the bank, half in the water, and lay there, struggling convulsively. At last she was still. Some minutes later, from 10 miles away on the towering, black-timbered shoulders of Pole Mountain, there stole out the most desolate cry in all the world, the howl of the gray timber wolf. It rode on the upper air without a tremor, high and thin, pointed as a needle. Through long minutes the note was sustained, mournful and remote, though through long moments it died, with a falling cadence of profound listlessness, and even before it ceased, it had become the very essence of the quiet of the night. Ken had seen the hunter's moon rise over the eastern horizon before he went upstairs, and lying in bed, wide awake and shaken by a steady, fine quivering, he could see it reflected in the opened casement window of his room. He hadn't completely undressed, but he had the sheet drawn up to his chin in case his mother or father came in to look at him. He heard them talking together in their room as they undressed. How long they took! It seemed to him hours before the whole house was quiet as the night was outside. He heard Flicka neigh, but he didn't hear Banner answer. Human ears were not keen enough to catch that distant greeting. He knew Flicka was neighing for him. He heard the wolf howl. He waited still another hour, till everyone was so deep asleep there would be no chance of their hearing. Then he stole out of bed and put on the rest of his clothes. He carried the shoes in his hands and crept down the hall, past the door of his parents' room, taking a half-minute for a step. On the far end of the terrace, he sat down and put on his shoes, his heart pounding and the blood almost suffocating him. He kept whispering, "I'm coming, Flicka, I'm coming." His feet pattered down the path. He ran as fast as he could. It was so dark under the cottonwood trees, he had to stand a moment, getting used to the darkness, before he could be sure that Flicka was not there. There stood her feed box, but the filly was gone. Unreasoning terror swept over him. Something had spirited her away. He would never see her again. Gus had come down, his father. He ran wildly here and there. At last, when there was no sign of her, he began a systematic search all through the pasture. He dared not call aloud, but he whispered, "Flicka, oh Flicka, where are you?" At last he found her down at the creek, lying in the water. Her head had been on the bank, but as she lay there, the current of the stream had sucked and pulled at her, and she had had no strength to resist, and little by little her head had slipped down until when Ken got there, only the muzzle was resting on the bank, and the body and legs were swinging in the stream. Ken slid into the water, sitting on the bank, and he hauled at her head. But she was heavy, and the current dragged like a weight, and he began to sob because he had no strength to draw her out. Then he found a leverage for his heels against some rocks in the bed of the stream, and he braced himself against them and pulled with all his might, and her head came up onto his knees, and he held it, cradled in his arms. He was glad that she had died of her own accord in the cool water under the moon instead of being shot by Gus. Then putting his face close to hers and looking searchingly into her eyes, he saw that she was alive and looking back at him. And then he burst out crying and hugged her and said, "Oh, my little Flicka, my little Flicka." The long night passed. The moon slid slowly across the heavens. The water rippled over Ken's legs and over Flicka's body, and gradually the heat and the fever went out of her, and the cool running water washed and washed her wounds.